these guys, they were drinking beers or smoking cigars, whatever. And I said, Jimmy, you're gonna have to shape up here. Danny's kicking your ass from the back of the boat. And he said, cribbing from Mark Twain, CD, I'm not gonna let my fishing get in the way of my fishing.
Hi everyone, Tim Schultz here. Hey, thank you for listening to the Reading the Water podcast. This episode features Chris Dombrowski, a poet, author, teacher, and river guide from Missoula, Montana. In 2016, Chris published a book about bone fishing in the Bahamas and called Body of Water that Jim Harrison prophetically pronounced as destined to be a classic. In his recent book, The River You Touch shares that destiny with a beautiful and deeply personal story about Montana's rivers and landscapes and the people who live there. In addition to these books, Chris and I are going to talk about his migration from Michigan to Montana, his development as a writer, a guide, and an educator, and we'll even debate whether or not A River Runs Through It is Norman Maclean's best story. I'm really looking forward to this, so let's get started. Well, hey Chris, how you doing today?
Great, Tim. How are you?
I'm doing wonderful. You got a lot of snow there?
No, man, it's been a really, really dry winter for us. Today's the 29th of February. It's about 48 outside, sort of spitting a little snow, but no, it's been a real dry winter for us in the West.
Yeah, it's the same here in the UP for the most part. We got a little bit of snow a couple of days ago, but I think it's going to start getting in the 50s, and that's going to be that may be the end of the snow, and that's rare. I've lived up here over 30 years, and this was the first brown Christmas I've seen.
Oh my gosh, really? Wow, that's
yeah, in the UP, huh?
It's hard to.
Hey, we're gonna do a deep dive. I want to go cover a bunch of different things, but I'm going to jump in. I'm going to come in kind of at a high level and thinking about a person who's a poet, who's a writer, fly fishing guide. Those I didn't look it up, but I don't think I'm going to find those at the top of the list of most lucrative financial security careers. But I'm going to give you two quotes, and one is from Hal Herring. I talked to Hal recently, and he is an amazing guy. You talk to him, we're talking about trot lines and limb lines that he's setting up for huge flathead catfish. And I mean, his eyes get big as silver dollars, talking about, those hunters come in at night and they're in those shallows hunting. And the next thing you know, the guy's quoting great poets. And I asked him, what's this connection? And his quote was something along the line, great books and great angling are both an exploration of the essential mystery. And so he sees the connection strong. He doesn't see that different at all. The other one will go way back in time a little bit, and this will be some UP stuff. Many, many years ago, the Life magazine photographer Bob Kelly came to the UP, and he was making a book called Anatomy of a Fisherman. And it was all about John Volker, who wrote as Robert Traver. And at some point he asked Volker, he said, what was it about trout fishing that would make a presumably intelligent man, one endowed with a 4-carat legal education, quit a more or less permanent job on the state's higher court to flee home to chase trout and write yarns about it? Volker's response was, just lucky, I guess. But anyway, with those two prompts, tell me about how a young man is drawn to be a poet and a fly fishing guide.
Man, Hal's quote is beautiful. I'd never heard that from him. Yeah, he's such a mystery in and of himself, just an essential dude, essential human being out here in the West. But I think that really gets at it in some ways. I was born and raised in Lansing, Michigan, and I think from a really early age, I found sort of a respite from suburbia in tiny little pockets of what I would call the natural world. Obviously the natural world is everywhere. It's in our lawns, manicured or unmanicured, and our hedgerows and it's rusting our cars, in our fenders. But those little pockets of creek, of river, of pond, that I had access to as a kid in little neighborhoods, or um, they offered connection to that essential mystery, and
Uh-huh.
once that sort of flame, for lack of a better metaphor, was sort of lit in my heart, it was just what I continued to seek. It was what I valued, and
Uh-huh.
what I eventually found in northern Michigan, and then found here in Montana, where I live now.
Mhm. Mhm. What you got? So you in Michigan, you got a bit of your first education at what it means to be a guide and be involved in fly fishing at Gates Lodge. If is that correct?
Yeah, that's right. Rusty Gates was an early mentor of mine, and it was this sort of like um, magical door that opened. My buddy Nick Popoff and I. Nick would go on to be a fantastic fisheries biologist, and in Michigan he worked with the tribes on the reintroduction of sturgeon, and then in Oregon and Washington he worked with uh, the sturgeon and salmon populations out there. Now he lives in Maine, and works for the Game and Fish, or whatever they call it out there. But Nick and I were early fishing buddies, and long time great friends. Um, we would ramble around in his old blue Oldsmobile that his dad had given him, and we fished everywhere together, sort of in southern Michigan, little smallmouth streams, little farm ponds, golf course ponds, condominium lakes. Um, didn't matter. We would fish anywhere. But as it would happen, my next door neighbor was a man named Rick Hicks, who owned a cabin on the South Branch of the Au Sable, and
Uh-huh.
he sort of heard word from my parents that, Chris has gone crazy into this like fishing world, and he that's all he thinks about. It's all he talks about. I certainly didn't think about school. Ironically, now that I'm a
Yeah.
college professor, um,
Right.
I thought a lot about sports. I thought a lot about young women, but really, what was at the top of my mind was fishing. Um, anyway, Rick Hicks had this cabin on the South Branch of the Au Sable, and he told my parents, "You should take Chris up to that river. You should see it."
Mhm.
And he'd known Rusty, and there was another neighbor that we had, Mr. Leonard, who gifted me a 7'9" 5 weight St. Croix glass rod. He was getting too old to fly fish, and his wife had
Uh-huh.
heard through the grapevine that I was a rabid angler, and uh, she said, come over someday. We have something for you, And sure enough, he gave me my first fly rod. So um, anyway, all of this is a long way of winding into the story of how we met Rusty. We My parents rented a cabin one summer. I think I was about 16. Um, boy, on the holy water, probably like a quarter mile, half mile at most from Gates Lodge. And
Uh,
the folks that owned it had left a note and said, "Tell your son to go in and see Rusty, ask him, what he needs fly wise, and so on and so forth, and he'll get started for the week." So my buddy Nick and I go in to the shop, and I think at the time we probably had, if I remember correctly, like $13 between us. Um, and here we are. We've been fishing like MEPS lures and Rapalas and sluggos and all the gummy baits in the world, and we're picking up these little flies. And if you're a kid doing the calculations, you're thinking, okay, there's 3 cents, there's 5 cents, so we're putting all these flies into this little bin, and Rusty's telling us, okay, you need some of these blueing olives, and you need some of these brown drakes that are still hatching at night, and you might need a few of these isonychias, and you need some tippet. and you need some of this floating, this gink here, you know, and you probably, do you guys have hemostats? No, we don't have hemostats. Okay, you need some hemostats, you know. So we get up there, and Rusty rings it all up, and he says, okay, that's and he's telling us along the way, you're going to fish these in the morning, you're going to fish these in the afternoon, and these at dusk. And he rings it all up, and he says, all right, that'll be like $62, you know. And we kind of scrounge around our pockets,
Uh,
and we come up with $13, and in true Rusty fashion, he says, I'll take it. Now get out of here and go fish them, you know. And so that was our introduction to Rusty. And probably that sort of like plucky, charming, naive, annoying personality that I had I probably still do as an adult, somehow endeared us to Rusty, and
sure.
he became a mentor. Early on, I worked in the shop, like tying flies or doing wade guiding trips. But really, what I mean, Rusty was an incredible fisherman, but what he was foremost to me was this avid, ardent conservationist, right? I mean, he
Hmm.
sort of spelled out the model for contemporary environmental conservation really early on. It was in the 80s when he sort of surveyed his constituency, his clientele at the lodge, and said, wait a minute, I have all these, you know, these lawyers, these doctors from downstate, um, from Chicago, from Ohio. If anyone can help me protect, you know, this resource, it's them. And so he formed the Anglers of the Au Sable, and it became
Hmm.
an incredibly um, powerful conservation group in northern Michigan. Still is, with Josh Greenberg at the helm. You know, Josh has taken
Right.
over and basically um, become Rusty too. Um, uh, Rusty
Right.
eyes, if you will, and so yeah, Rusty was he was an amazing mentor to me. Often let me stay for long passages of time at his cabin on Big Creek when I first started writing. Um, there were always books
Uh,
there. I can still remember encountering Jim Harrison's collection After EQ, um,
uh-huh.
on that shelf there. But and back to, you know, the Volcker quote that you mentioned. Uh, you know, there were scores of books on the shelves there, and I was always reading them, sort of um, in between fishing excursions. Uh, the guides there were all my
Yeah. Yeah.
heroes, of course, right? There was Craig Perry, um, Jimmy Calvin, George Alexander, whose
Uh,
late wife Peggy, would go on to be really a grandmother to me. I fished Peggy, I guided Peggy for um, 23 years, you know,
uh-huh.
and just became the best of friends. You know, when you're 16, 17 years old and you see these guys coming in with a slight hangover and raccoon eyes um from their guide day, like what could be better, at least in the eyes of a kid. Um so yeah, I have just a real rich history with Rusty, and I wanted to get back to the Volcker quote because after my first book of nonfiction came out, Body of Water, I got a
Yeah.
really sweet letter from um, from Volcker's grandson.
Oh,
He's
Adam.
Yeah, he reached out to me and he
Yeah.
said he sent me a letter and he said, you know, your publisher, whatever, put me in touch. Here are some flies that my grandfather used to fish. Um, and here's a couple of mementos from his campaigns. And he sent me like a Volker for
Oh,
Congress matchbook. And
yeah.
he said, my grandfather would have loved your book. And this is a way I have of saying that or whatnot. So, yeah, it's a cool,
Oh, wonderful.
mhm.
Yeah. Adam's he has got uh oh, just hordes of his grandfather's old flies, fly rods. He's got the old hat, the old worn out fedora, and he's a fishy dude.
Oh,
Is more.
cool.
I don't think I've never met anyone with more fly rods than that guy.
Wow,
He's
that's
loaded. Yeah, yeah. Hey, I want to ask you. I was going to ask about the mix. So a general question. You go into a lot of fly shops these days. The guides are it's a pretty young crowd. What was Gates like back then? Was it a good mix? Did it have a mix of the young guys, but then had several of these older fellas? And then I'm going to ask you or tell you a quick story about Jimmy Calvin that I think is just hilarious.
Yeah, man,
Yeah.
he's a nut. No,
Well,
no, no. The crowd was all, old, kind of stodgy dudes for the most part. I mean,
yeah.
we were the young bloods, and most of the old guys, a lot of them sort of took us under their wing. They would say, "Hey,
Yeah.
you want to go fish the swamp tonight on the South Branch? Like, I'll pick you up at 9, and we'll go see if the drakes pop there." We were always incessantly bugging them for information and to see if they would go fishing or please God float us. Like we didn't have boats
Yeah.
at the time, so we were always
Yeah.
trying to float. I remember Rusty got me this job one summer painting cabins, and there was sort of an old I guess it was maybe an old trout camp on the South Branch that had been abandoned and then repurchased by somebody in Ohio, and they needed the cabins painted, repainted. And so
Uh-huh.
I got to post up there all summer and paint these cabins,
Oh,
of course, timing um my work around the lulls in the hatches, if you will. And
yeah.
that sort of turned into a little bit of a bachelor pad. I would invite my buddies up and we would drink some beers and wait for the bugs to pop. But for the most part, this sort of new wave of angler of the young folks, I don't know. There weren't too many of us around.
Yeah. I had a float with Jimmy Calvin once, and 2 things really stood out there. One, I was asking him about, does he so many guides on especially when those rivers are crowded like they can get at hex time, whatnot. Did he exchange information with fellow guides on a cell phone and say, "Hey, there's 4 boats down here, you might wanna blah, blah, blah." He said, "No, no, I don't do that." And he said, for a lot of reasons, but one is I don't own a cell phone. And I thought, how does anyone not own a cell phone? And he said, I don't have any use for those things. And then I asked him, is it kind of a goofy question, right? You say, like, uh, you ever get any rough clients, any client that just makes you for a really long day on the river? And he said, no, most guys are okay. He said, he said every once in a while you get some that tell you all about the fish they catch in Montana, but for the most part they're pretty good. Said, except for those lawyers. And I just said, well, and we didn't say a word. It was actually Bob DeMott was with me, and he said, "You guys aren't lawyers, are you?" And we said, "No, no, no." And I said, "What's the problem with the lawyers?" He said, "Well," he said, "every time you tell them to cast to the right side of the boat, they cast to the left because they think you're lying."
Ah, that's good. That's
Yeah,
good.
yeah, yeah. I mean, I thought, oh my god, this is like this is a breed that's probably going extinct one day. But guys like that, huh?
Yeah. I mean,
Yeah,
everything
yeah,
you say about Jimmy is true to my memory of him. He used to come out. We shared a client who has now passed on, but um, this client Danny Gilland would bring Jim out with him in Montana every fall, and
uh-huh.
so I got to guide Jimmy for
Oh
several
yeah,
years out here, which was a real sort of neat turn from having growing up, you know,
yeah.
pestering him for information. And I have a couple funny stories about Jim.
Sure.
Once one was I remember this one day, we were fishing down the lower Clark Fork, and it was a beautiful, like fall Batis morning. These guys always came um, right around like the 15th of October, which is a great time of year to be out here fishing dry flies for rising trout. And um, on this particular morning, Jimmy was fishing in the front, and Danny, our shared client, was fishing in the back, and Dan was just smoking him from the back of the boat, And I said, these guys, they were drinking beers or smoking cigars, whatever, and I said, Jimmy, you're gonna have to shape up here. Danny's kicking your ass from the back of the boat, and he said, cribbing from Mark Twain, CD, I'm not gonna let my fishing get in the way of my fishing, you know, uh, which I always
That's
love.
great.
And then another
Yeah.
time we were fishing on the Bitterroot together, and he'd been fishing out of the back of the boat, smoking a cigarette, and he'd reeled up. He'd reeled up his streamer. It was sort of toward the end of the day, and out of nowhere, I hear he had this old Hardy reel, I hear his Hardy just screeching like, "Rah, rah," and I thought to myself, oh, he left his, streamer dangling in the water. It hooked a piece of hooked a deadfall or something like that. I have to row back upstream, damn it, Jimmy, get your stuff together. Um I look back, and he has this like 22-inch brown that's just leaping across the back of the uh across the river behind us. And I said, Jimmy, what the hell's going on back there? I thought you weren't fishing. He said, I wasn't fishing, but then I felt the bite, so I started fishing.
That's great. Yeah.
Classic,
So
the Zen of Jim Calvin,
yeah, yeah. So how do you get from a kid hanging around Gates Lodge to a kid, I think you were still pretty young, towing a drift boat into Twin Bridges looking for a job?
Yeah, man, that's about what I was doing. Um,
Yeah.
um, yeah, there is sort of I was do you know the book The Bird Artist? It's a
No,
great
no.
it's a novel that came out in the mid 90s from Howard Norman. So just a
Uh-huh.
beautiful book, but the main character in that is he's a bird artist. He's from Newfoundland. He draws oh shoot, my Siri just connected. Hold on. Let me get out of here
That's
real
all right.
quick. Okay. Well, she got out of there. Did you hear that? Um
I heard that. We can edit that.
okay. Anyway, so
Or
this
not.
this main the main character he's a bird artist from Newfoundland, and he draws birds and ducks and whatnot. And, he falls in love with this young woman, and he says the eeriest thing about fate, it seems to me, is how you try to deny it, even when it's teaching you to kiss. And he's talking about this encounter with this young woman, but you know I was just sort of rolling through Twin Bridges, um, on my way to see a young woman who I was in love with and
Uh-huh.
who would later become my wife and lifelong
Ah,
partner. And I thought, oh, I'll swing through this little fly shop. I've seen it before. It looks like a cool place. And in the middle of winter, Tom Harmon, who was the uh, the owner of that shop, just happened to be in there tying a fly. I remember distinctly, he was tying a George Grant creeper. It's a woven body fly that takes half an hour to tie. It's got monofilament sort of braided together on it, and
oh my
it was an
gosh.
old like heavy sinking stonefly imitation. Um and I just struck up a conversation with him, and it just so happened that the one mutual acquaintance we had was a woman who I had met while working at Gates Lodge. And this was Annette Maclean of Winston Rods. Annette's,
Oh, wow.
sort of
Yeah.
heart and soul of Winston now. But when Annette had come through repping rods with Jerry Custich, um,
Uh-huh.
Rusty had said, "Hey, do take these guys down to the South Branch, show them where to fish, what to use, and then shuttle their car for them, and put a few beers in this cooler, and whatever. So Annette and I had struck up a friendship, and it just so happened that, when I knocked on Tom's door, he said, "Well, do you have anyone around here I could call for a reference?" And I said, "The only person I really know is Annette Maclean." And Tom said, Annette's sort of universally respected in Southwest Montana. And Tom said, "If you know Annette, that's good enough for me." And so that was, that sort of that door of fate opening up. And I um embrace the learning curve, shall we say. My
Yeah,
early
yeah.
years of guiding were filled with sort of these comedic failures. I remember early on, speaking of Winston, I had this beloved Winston Abel combo that my grandmother had given me for high school graduation, and it was probably worth more than my truck, but or it was worth about the same as my truck. And on one of my first guide trips, I had loaned it to this client. And because back in the day, a lot of what you got for clients were dudes showing up with other dudes, or if the dude came with his wife or significant other, he didn't have any gear for them, for the
Uh-huh.
wife. He just would, or the gear that he bought for her was sort of cruddy, insufficient. So I
Uh-huh.
let this woman on one of my first guide trips um, use my Winston, and we stopped for lunch on the Big Hole, and this is great. Um, we have lunch. We sit on the bank. We have lunch, and when we get back in the boat, I pull up anchor, push off. All right, you guys. There's some caddis popping off right now, so let's put those bugs close to the willows on the bank. There's, you know, good chance we'll get to get into some rising fish here soon. And the woman, bless her heart, said, what did you do with the rod?" And I sort of stopped, she was in the back of the boat. I said, "You mean the rod you were using?" And she said, "Yeah, what did you do with it?" And I said, I didn't do anything with it. Like you were fishing with it. What did you do with it?" And she said, "Oh, I left it leaning up against the boat at lunch on the shore, And so what had inevitably happened was that the rod had been leaning up against the boat. The boat sawed out with the current. The rod dropped in the water, and it was gone forever. So, anyway, we go on and on and on. I go back to look for the rod. It's not there, and we sort of uh, I suffer my way through the afternoon, biting my tongue and just calculating how much it's going to cost me to get a new Winston and an Able. Um, The day gets done. I show back up on Tom's doorstep where all the guides convene at the end of the day to sort of drink a beer and talk about the spoils or the travesties of client relationships, whatever the case might be. And I describe the situation to Tom, and he immediately says, "That was your fault." And I was so upset. I thought, oh, he would commiserate with me. He would say, "Oh man, I can't believe she did that. Uh, what a joke, blah, blah, blah." And he said, "These clients are like children. You have to teach them everything. You have to tell them everything, you know?" Um,
Right, right.
and so that was the sort of the entrance into guiding for me. Uh, it's interestingly enough, as we're sort of talking about
Yeah.
fate, um, on that same trip, on that same day, I had come across another boat. It was two guides, as it were, just out fun fishing, and the guide in the front of the boat had a fantastic reach cast, and I had been trying to teach the reach cast to these clients without much success. And so, as we were passing them, I think I anchored up and said, "Hey, will you show us that reach cast again? We've been working on it, and we could use a good example." And the guy in the front performed a perfect reach cast, and whatever. We split ways, and they past us and went on to fish for the rest of the afternoon. When I got to my truck in the afternoon, at the end of the day, sort of cursing myself and head and hands that this rod was now disappeared. There was a note on my windshield, and it said, "Hey, we liked your style. We have some days for you, some guide days if you're interested. Give us a call." And at the time, I had you know I'd spent my savings on a drift boat. I had a loan on a truck. I had rent on a cabin. Um, and I think I had 2 days in the book between like May 20th and October 20th. So, of
Uh-huh.
course, I called these guys right up, and both of them have turned into be lifelong friends. I still see them. They actually live up in Missoula now. But, um,
Uh-huh.
you know, um, as the old Chinese poet said, who knows what causes the opening and closing of a door? Um, Sometimes the door opens and you
Yeah.
walk in. Other times it doesn't open. Other times it opens and you don't walk in. Um,
Right.
it's a strange sort of cocktail of events for me to um, look
Uh,
back.
yeah. Hey, is that was that the era that you many years ago did a profile on Glenn Brackett?
Yeah, I was
Is that
living.
about the time?
That was exactly the time I was living in Twin Bridges, and I met Glenn in the post office there, and I have no idea what inspired me to try to write a profile on him. I was, if anything, then I was writing poems, you know.
Uh-huh.
Um,
Uh-huh.
um, Maybe Annette urged me, into sort of investigating like this interesting dude. Um, but I didn't know Tom By at the time. Tom is the
Uh-huh.
editor of the Drake, who eventually
Right, right.
published that piece in their first or second issue ever. Um, that Brackett piece. Um, but again, this is sort of like all these lives that or began up at Gates Lodge, sort of fusing together and gaining more momentum um, onto this path of mine that would become writer slash fishing guide. May have been. It was always something that I envisioned, like
Uh-huh.
living those two lives together. When I was in high school, um, I was obsessed with The River Runs Through It. I had
Uh-huh.
a great teacher who pressed the book into my hand and said, "Hey, you need to read this book." Um, and I did, and would go on to lengthy investigations of Maclean. And one of the um, interviews that I dug up way, way back was with Maclean and Kay Benetti for the American Audio Prose Library. And it's a beautiful sort of um, combination of voices. Maclean is in his 80s when he's being interviewed, and he has this gruff, sort of old, cigarette sanded voice, and Benetti has this real sort of light, high pitched voice, and so it's a beautiful dichotomy. But anyway, she asks him like, "What was it like for you going back and forth between Montana and the University of Chicago in those early days, teaching Shakespeare?" And he said, "It was a recipe for schizophrenia, but I was determined not to let it happen." Um, so in many ways, from a really early age, I was sort of intrigued by this possibility of sort of, you know, orbiting in two different worlds, or worlds that at the
Mhm.
time
Mhm.
I saw as different, but that I would later come to see as quite intertwined.
Right. Yeah. Hey, on Glenn Brackett,
Mhm.
I shared something. Do you know Kathy Scott? Yeah, she's a writer, rod builder
Mhm.
in Maine, I think.
Oh.
Anyway, I shared this with her, and I quoted you. I stole your words, but with attribution. when you were describing Glenn Brackett, because I mean, you mentioned Jerry just a moment ago, Jerry Kustich. Here's how you describe Glenn Brackett. You said, a kind of cross between your college poetry professor and an old time train conductor. And but what occurred to me is like, that's all of them. You know, I don't know. You know, Ron Barch here in Michigan, a great bamboo rod. But you look at all of these rod builders, like, and, you know, my thought about that was like, is this, you know, I think it's been disproved, but a lot of people will say, holy cow. Well, a lot of people will say that married couples start looking alike the longer they're together. And I wonder, is that's what happens with these fly rod builders? Or-
Yeah, man, that's
but
possible. I mean, those guys were like, I just remember walking into that old Winston shop back in Twin Bridges back in the day. It was like walking into another world. You know, it was clear these guys
yeah,
were, you know, Southwest Montana at that time had a few, sort of what you would call trophy properties, but it was very
uh,
much like authentic cowtown from Dillon all the
yeah,
way over to Madison to Ennis on the Madison, you know, and Twin Bridges was particularly cowtown. I mean, I remember Glenn saying we chose it as a hub for Winston because we wanted to situate the company in a town that we thought wouldn't grow over the course of 25 years. And in many
ah,
ways, they were right. I mean, I think the population is
yeah,
still small down there, but it's definitely been sort of um, uh, it's been it's got its fair number of tourists nowadays, you know.
right, yeah,
But when you walked into the old Winston bamboo shop, you know, these guys were like listening to the Grateful Dead. They had, you know, someone had a book on tape. Someone was listening to a book by the Dalai Lama. Someone was like, you know, spinning a rod on the Turners. It was a fascinating sort of juxtaposition of worlds between like what was going on otherwise in Twin Bridges, Montana,
uh-huh,
and then thinking about like where these rods were going out into the world. It
yeah.
was a cool experience.
Yeah. You know, we're kind of converging toward. We'll eventually talk very explicitly about the river you touch. But so I'm trying, like, I'm taking the kid from the crotchety old guides in Michigan, going out buying a drift boat and giving it what the heck. I'm going to be a fishing guide. But then we just talked about, you wrote a little article about Glenn Brackett, and you were doing poetry at the time. So when did you know you wanted to be a writer? When did that hit you?
Really early on, I mean, in life,
Uh-huh.
I guess. That same high school teacher, Jim Calando, that gave me A River Runs Through It. He was a fantastic teacher. He was an artist himself. He was a photographer, beautiful photographer, and he encouraged me to write about the natural world, which I'd never been encouraged to do before by other teachers, you know. And then he continued to press books into my hand by writers who
Uh-huh.
depicted the natural world or whose characters trafficked it, you know. And suddenly I thought to myself, okay, um, I didn't think, oh, I can do this immediately. Not at all. I thought I have to do this, you know.
Uh-huh.
The can do it came very, very, very later on.
Yeah.
And sometimes,
Did
you know,
did you feel that same way about guiding, about a life in fishing too? I mean, there's these parallel lives. Did you feel you had to do the guiding, or was that just
um, I don't know, man. That's a great question. I think I ended up guiding as a profession before I ended up guiding as a vocation, you know? I
yeah.
think like I had to do it, but I had to do it because I had bills to pay, you know? Not like
Right,
I had
right,
to do it in the old fashioned sense of a calling. Um,
right.
I it was more or less like, okay, where am I in life? I'm broke. This is a thing I can do. I love to be outside. I don't mind being around people. In fact, for um, a hermit, I can be pretty social. Um, I
Yeah.
um, I guess I saw it as sort of um an alternative. The more I look back on it, I saw it as more of um an alternative way to make a living. Um,
Uh-huh.
that's how I saw it. And I just never thought beyond um the day or the week or the month. Like, what else was
Yeah.
I going to do? I didn't have a plan for my life or anything like that. I mean, if someone had said like, what's your 20-year plan? What's your 5-year plan? I would have said it's the same thing. I'm going to go fishing and I'm going to write.
Uh-huh.
Um, and I'm doing that today. So why do I need to worry about, 20 years down the line? Of course, that's extremely
Right.
naive. Um, taking into no consideration inflation or the housing costs in Montana or
Yeah.
family and children, anything like that.
Healthcare.
Um, sure, yeah.
Yeah.
No, none of that crossed my mind at all. But yeah, I mean, I felt early on very called to be um, a writer, and that gets back to the sort of that Hal quote that you opened up with. Which
Yeah,
I love.
yeah. Isn't that great?
I thought, yeah,
He's just loaded with those. I bet you could, talk to him for 10 hours and he'd just keep coming up with new quotes like that. Uh, hey, it's
yeah.
kind of an odd question maybe, but, I recently reading some, Ann Patchett, like, The Story of a Happy
Mm,
Marriage, I think, talked about it, right? And she says if I that, she loves writing fiction, but she finds nothing more difficult to do than write she would rather wash dishes, take out the trash, certainly write nonfiction, but she finds it really difficult thing to do. Do, do you ever have that trouble with any particular kind of writing, or writing in general? Is it difficult, or are you constantly hoping for the next open time when you can get to the desk and write?
I mean, I am constantly hoping for that next open field of time, but
Yeah, yeah,
I also share that sentiment, I guess, with Patchett, whose writing I love, whose novels
yeah.
Mary, my wife, loves too. Um, but I feel that way alternately about um, poetry and nonfiction. More so with nonfiction,
Uh-huh,
long
uh-huh,
form nonfiction, because I think it's very much like writing a novel. Long form
uh-huh.
nonfiction is, you know. I I can if you said, "Hey, can you write me an article tomorrow on um, growing up in Michigan and everything we've talked about?" Sure, I could do it
Yeah.
tomorrow. Um,
Uh-huh, uh-huh.
and and poems seem to have to only be possible for me when I'm really inhabiting um, a certain mind space, a meditative mind space,
Mhm.
I guess. Um, uh, but nonfiction, yeah, it's really hard for me. It is.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. Yeah. On the poetry thing, so I'm gonna like throw 3 topics, 4 topics together, I guess, that I want to talk with you about. And they're Jim Harrison, and that's going to come up again, of course. Brian Doyle,
Oh yeah.
uh, Mike Delp,
Hmm.
and then related, I guess, is to talk about the fine line between poetry and prose.
Mhm.
And is it a fine line? Because I sometimes I think it is. An example I use. I was talking with someone recently about this, and Brian Doyle. I mean, that's a guy that can make me cry.
Mhm.
He's incredible. And in his book, I think it's Mink River,
Mhm.
there's a fellow with just a few days to live, and he's telling this the boy Daniel what he remembers about, these are the things I love, right? And as
Mhm.
I'm reading that, I mean, that's a novel, but that's poetry. I think. I don't know though. I'm not an expert on poetry. So there's a lot of topics I want to get through, and if you can work them together somehow. But
Well,
your
I mean,
stories with Harrison.
those three would be a wonderful, wonderful dinner.
Oh my
Jim,
gosh.
Delp, and Brian Doyle. Obviously Doyle
Yeah.
passed away a few years ago along with Jim. Um,
Jim. Yeah.
but I've been going through my old emails with Harrison because I wanted to sort of catalog them. I just thought, if
Uh-huh.
suddenly Microsoft dies, I don't have any like record of this really rich correspondence. And there's this one email in which I ask him uh, if he ever thought about the relationship between his poetry and his prose. And he
Uh-huh.
said, it's interesting that you would ask that. He said, David Foster Wallace asked me the same thing. And I've often, and I never really think about it, basically, is what he said. I try to stay as far
Uh-huh.
away um, from any understanding of my own process as I can, you know? Um,
Uh-huh.
and then he said something totally Jim, like, you know, the goose that lays the golden egg should not look at its rump. Um,
Did he say rump?
he actually did. I always quoted him as saying ass, but I went back
Uh-huh.
and looked at it and he says rump. Um,
Oh, okay.
right, right. But I also remember him saying, like, when I was first foraying into nonfiction, he said, "Be careful, poetry is a fickle muse." And I have found that to be very true. I can only
Uh-huh.
write poetry when I'm writing poetry. You know, um,
Uh-huh.
I can't just say pick it up and say I'm going to write a poem today. I have to be in practice, if you will. It's much like
Yeah,
like
yeah.
yoga to me. I mean, I could I could attempt a series of yoga poses, but being out of practice, I would probably like pull a muscle right away.
Uh-huh. Uh-huh.
So um,
Yeah.
yeah, I mean, the relationship for me between poetry and prose is that I can't very most often I cannot do them at the same time. Um,
Uh-huh.
you know, um,
Yeah.
I have some great notes from an early draft of Body of Water, um, where my friend David James Duncan was editing the book for me, the
Uh-huh.
manuscript, and he had this little acronym that he devised. It was PWP, which translated to poet, write prose, exclamation point. And so
Uh-huh.
um, you know, I've found that it's been very important for me to sort of recognize early on, like what's the impulse here? Is the impulse poetic? Is it sort of based on sound and rhythm and imagery and suggestion, or is it something else that's maybe a little more thematic or subject focused, etc., story focused,
Uh-huh.
right? And that latter would be falling into the nonfiction category for me, which my nonfiction is, strongly um, situated in the creative nonfiction category.
Right. Yeah, yeah. I think all of those guys you'd put them in the category of inspirations for you. But I want to talk about another person, so I'm going to go in this way. Do you find inspiration from musicians,
Oh,
songwriters? Yeah, who are some of the top ones for you?
um, it's funny because back to my old high school teacher, Calando, he used to record for us every week. He would make a mix of 5 songs on cassette tapes, and then he would print out the lyrics. He would type out and print out the lyrics to each of the songs.
Yeah.
He was an insomniac, so this helped him, I guess. Um, and then we would get a packet of these songs every week, and we would. I think there was some like extra credit on our end of the week vocabulary test if we could like talk about a song we admired or something like that.
Uh-huh, uh-huh.
So there was a buy-in, if you will, but I just early on fell in love with songwriting as an art form. And
Yeah,
so those, of course, in that old era of songs, we would listen to Dylan and Joni Mitchell and Paul Simon, Tracy Chapman. I can remember Steve Earle on that, on those
yeah,
mixes. Um, Tons and tons of people who are sort of in the Springsteen in the twilight of their career. And then sort of years went by before I found someone that I thought was like um, a worthy inheritor to all that tradition, and that was this musician Jeffrey Foucault, um,
uh-huh,
who's a super close friend of mine now. But early on,
yeah,
when I heard him, the first time I heard him, I thought, okay, all that stuff that I fell in love with, the Guy Clark, the John Prine, it didn't die
yeah,
out. It's sort of regenerated or reconstituted in this new. And then now, I mean, there are tons and tons of musicians that I would sort of put in that category. Like if I close my eyes and like just look at my phone and what music is on there. I have another friend, Martha Scanlon, who's a Missoula based musician who I love. I'm incredibly fond of Bon Iver, Justin Vernon's
uh-huh,
band. Um, my buddy Sean Carey, who plays drums in that band, um, is a fantastic songwriter as well. He lives in Wisconsin. He's a huge um,
yeah,
fly fisherman too. He would be a good podcast guest. Um,
uh-huh, okay.
Sean Wood. Um, and let's see who else is in there. I mean, um, I can cheat here and look at my um I'm gonna look at my list here. Who's in my list? I mean, I'm a rabid Van Morrison fan.
Uh-huh,
You know, um I really love this new singer-songwriter from Washington named Margot Silker,
uh-huh,
Cilker. She has a fantastic new album out called Valley of Heart's Delight. I could go on and on, but
yeah, yeah, yeah.
I, I think of I used to teach a class called Elements of Poetry through Songwriting. That was fun.
Really?
Mhm.
Oh, yeah, yeah. I just sent going back to Hal Herring, I don't I forget what we were talking about, but it reminded me, I sent him little snippets of lyrics from, one of my favorite songwriters, James McMurtry.
Oh yeah, yeah,
Oh, God, I just some of the stuff make me cry,
yeah.
and,
He's awesome.
he is
I've seen him
incredible.
play a
I
couple times in Missoula. He plays a
Oh,
lot.
yeah?
Oh yeah, yep.
Yeah.
Mhm.
His stuff is I mean, it's beautiful. Your friend Jeffrey Foucault, I found him looking for John Prine,
Mhm.
and he has the cover album, which,
Yeah.
oh my god, his interpretation of those songs is unbelievable,
Right.
and you guys are good friends. How did that come to be? How
Fishing, of course.
Yeah.
Um, as it would happen, some mutual friends of ours um, were passing through town, and they just arranged a dinner, sort of, for us to meet.
Uh-huh,
And
uh-huh.
we went fishing the next day, and sort of became very quick and avid correspondence. And Jeffrey writes a hell of a letter. He's also a one mean sob as an editor, but a fantastic editor. And so
Oh, yeah.
super early on, he became one of my first readers. Really,
Uh-huh.
he's more well read than most writing professors I know, sadly. But
Uh-huh, uh-huh.
so yeah, that
That's good.
that's how that sort of came to be. And we we're both busy folks. I mean, he's touring a lot. He has an incredible new album coming out called
Yeah.
The Universal Fire is what it's called. The title comes from that the Universal Records fire that
Uh-huh,
occurred way
uh-huh.
back in the 60s where they
Uh,
lost all those masters. Um, but beautiful, beautiful album. Um, anyhow, we don't
yeah,
get to see each other quite enough, but we still manage to fish a couple times a
good.
year, usually bird hunt
Yeah.
too.
Yeah, I don't I apologize right now. I don't know if I made them the name of the song might be "Dishes," but the first line is "Do the dishes." And
Yeah.
that is one of those songs, if it comes on a playlist of mine, I don't care what I'm doing, I stop it. I just
Mhm.
stop right then. That song is powerful, powerful for me. Hey, you compared him, you said, better than a lot of, writing teachers that, so let's talk about teaching a little bit. So let's say you direct the creative writing program at University of Montana, right?
I
Right.
do, yeah.
So what? And you taught at Interlochen back
Mhm.
in Michigan.
Yeah,
What?
before yeah. Mhm.
Yeah. What? So do you find? And then as a fly fishing guide, you teach people to fly fish. Are those different? Are those similar? How are they similar? How are they different? How is teaching writing and teaching? Are any overlap?
That's a great question. I mean, um, I think there's some overlap. There's some overlap in the sense that, you know, specificity of language, what
Mhm.
Pound called fundamental accuracy of statement, um, is is very important, in both trades, if you will. Um, but boy, um, I never really thought about that, Tim. That's a great question. I,
Yeah.
I think that teaching is a little bit harder than guiding because often when
Yeah.
you're teaching, you're in a classroom. People are sort of stationary. They're sitting. There's not like this um, kind of river going by them that is. I find that like being on the river with people sort of unlocks or dissolves rather like an armor that people otherwise put up. They become more
Sure.
vulnerable. I've had people tell me
Yeah,
over
yeah.
the years, like um, incredibly personal things that just seem to sort of come out of nowhere.
Uh-huh, uh-huh. Mhm.
Expressions of love for the natural world or for like that essential mystery that Hal brought up. Whereas in a classroom, sometimes you're dealing with the sort of stink of a classroom, right? Where people
Right,
are
right.
trying their best to sound intelligent, teachers included, right? And so I
Sure.
find like I work hard to sort of break that dynamic down, if you will,
Mhm.
and to try to make it a more like openly vulnerable place where we're all there comfortable like making mistakes, whereas that's not necessarily the template that people come in with all the time. I had a fantastic teacher in undergrad, a writer named Jack Riddle, who's a poet, and his father was a um, U of Pittsburgh basketball coach, Buzz Riddle, famous coach there,
Uh-huh.
mentored John Calipari and a bunch of other,
Oh,
um,
wow.
yeah, famous coaches. But Riddle was a genius at sort of um, demystifying the writing process,
Uh-huh.
and I attempt, I guess, to sort of um, carry some of that same sentiment into my classrooms. I think if we think about writing as something we do, it becomes part
Yeah,
of our
yeah.
practice. It doesn't become this like mysterious, sort of untouchable, enigmatic thing. But I tend to think that um, writing is harder to teach, but more rewarding.
Uh-huh.
I mean, it's
Yeah.
incredibly rewarding to a student, watch a student's voice grow, watch them sort of break through into their true subject matter,
Uh-huh.
watch them maybe find some success, publish a book. That's incredibly rich and rewarding and way more than like watching someone catch another 28 out or something like that.
Yeah, yeah. Hey, this is another thing that I think Ann Patchett was talking about, and she said, you as a writer, you tell someone you're a writer, and they go, "Oh, I have a great novel in me," and she said someone once said, "Everybody has a great novel in them," and I'm paraphrasing, maybe add some of my own, but you don't ever hear someone say, if I tell them I'm a mathematician, they don't say, "Oh, I everybody has a great mathematical theorem in them," or if I'm an artist, "Oh, everyone has a great painting in them," or I'm a golfer, everyone has a hole in one.
Mhm.
But why do people think, "Oh, everyone could be a good writer, has a great story to tell"? Is it?
Yeah. I mean, it's a good question. I think it's true, though. I think it's true.
Yeah.
I think the reason why folks say that is because we traffic in story, right?
Uh-huh.
I mean, we traffic in math too, but sort of
Yeah.
unwittingly or unknowingly, right? It's the numbers
Yeah.
are way beneath the surface. Whereas story is something that we traffic in every day, right?
Yeah.
We
Yeah.
hear our neighbor tells the story about the deer that ran into their car and smashed through the back window, and we're listening. And then we tell that story to our friend. Did you hear Karen? The deer jumped through her back window and she had to pull it out, and so
Yeah.
in that sense, like story is um more part of our sort of, I guess, mythical existence.
Uh-huh.
It's at the root of why we live, right? I saw this quote from Marilyn Robinson, who wrote Gilead.
Okay.
She taught forever at the University of Iowa, and she Gilead is probably her most famous novel. She wrote another one called Housekeeping. But she had this beautiful quote in the New York Times the other day. She said, "There's a holiness in the fact that people are living in the world in a way that makes them feel that the world is addressed to them."
Uh-huh.
And that, I think, is
Yeah, yeah,
story, right? I mean, the reason why the person who has never picked up a pen thinks, "Oh, I have a
yeah,
good novel in me," is because they are processing the world in a way that makes them feel like their existence is addressed to them, which I think is
yeah,
beautiful. It's really beautiful.
yeah, yeah, yeah. Do you I find myself, and I wonder how many other people do this. So if I'm fishing alone, um, I am constantly narrating to myself what's happening. And it's and I if I think about it too much, I can't. It'll stop. But then I'll just narrate the fact that I just stopped it,
Mm.
but it's just I'm constantly talking in my head, even though I'm not saying a word. Do, do you know what I'm talking about? Is it just me in the world that does this?
Um, it's funny. I know exactly what you're talking about, but when I fish or when I hunt, I hear that brain shutting off, and that's what I
Uh-huh, uh-huh.
relish in it.
Yeah,
Um,
yeah,
I do. I sort of encounter it in images or nouns. I like to think that
yeah,
when I'm bird hunting, say behind our amazing 10-year-old setter Zeke, that my world gets reduced to sort of a noun based existence. Where
uh-huh,
I'm just
uh-huh.
like cataloging what I'm seeing, and that narrative. Sometimes that narrative brain clicks on, and I'll
Yeah,
hear a sentence, and then I'll like whip out my phone and sort of dictate it into the phone and say,
yeah,
um, "Here's the sort of the notes for the narrative notes for the day." But when I'm fishing or when I'm hunting, that tends to turn off for me. But then
uh-huh,
as soon as I'm done, it sort of turns back on, and then this flood of
yeah,
footage comes in, and but that's cool.
yeah, yeah. No,
Would you say that
it's usually. It's usually completely in the moment. It
yeah,
you know, I'm not I mean, anything that's bothering me is gone.
yeah,
But, I'll find myself, almost like I'm describing this situation to somebody. "Hey, did you see that rise over there? And
yeah,
what are we gonna do? Well, we're gonna get on our knees, I think." Yeah. And I
yeah.
just could tell it's totally in it.
There's your story, right? I mean, that's
Yeah,
your
right,
story,
right, right.
right? Yeah.
Yeah,
Um, we tell ourselves stories in order to exist, I think, is what William Kittredge
yeah.
says. You know, what does he say? I'm trying to remember the quote in my own book, but he says, we tell ourselves stories, and when we're in trouble when we don't recognize the story we're telling to ourselves, or something like that. You know,
Yeah, yeah, yeah. Well, speaking of stories, let's talk about a big one. People want to hear more of this story, the story of Chris. They can get it, and they can get it in the river you touch. And oh my gosh, there's so much in that. I've read it, and but I've also, because I'm such a big Jeffrey Foucault fan, I let him read it to me, which is spectacular. You had to be so happy that he did that for you, huh?
man, that
Yeah,
was such a huge gift. I don't know if
yeah.
I'll ever repay him for that quite sufficiently, but yeah, that was awesome. I
Yeah,
can't
it had
listen to
it
myself. I can't listen to myself. You know, recordings of myself either. So it was
yeah,
um, doubly wonderful for me to have him record that,
yeah,
because it meant that I could listen to the book. You know,
yeah, yeah. Oh, and he did such a great, job, uh, I hope I don't goof this up, but I'm gonna read one the early line, right?
I love it.
At its uppermost source, this book began as a love song to the rivers on which I've guided for 25 years and the land through which they pulse like veins. And that is what it is. It's just wonderful, and there's so many. I mean, I loved it. I so many stories about family, and I love the immediate family and extended family. And if I think you'll agree with me if I say your clients that are your family, and just incredible stories, and you brought them all together. Um, uh, One of the things I noticed in it, and it brought me back. I got to tell you, I think it was in Angler's Journal, your story, The Gospel According to Jim,
Mhm.
is that and that
Yeah.
and that you built that throughout the book.
Mhm.
And I heard you when you talked to Hal say that the book was initially started, or the initial idea was it was going to be a collection of those essays, and you didn't want to do that. You wanted to turn it into the story that it came to be. And when did you realize that? And when did you know, when you started writing? Did you know what that book was going to be, start to finish, or how did it just come to life with you?
No, it really just came to life over several years, really, and with
Yeah.
some wonderful editorial help from my editor and publisher, Daniel Slager, at Milkweed. Um, I knew, I thought that the book was originally going to be a collection, a sort of a collection of essays based on, the original title was The Nature of Wonder. Um,
Uh-huh.
and the more I processed that title, I realized that um, the wonder, getting back to sort of your Brian Doyle reference, the wonder that I was referencing there wasn't only necessarily my wonder at the natural world, but it was that my children had sort of reinvigorated that in
Uh-huh.
me, right?
Yeah,
Doyle
yeah.
was the editor at, in addition to being an incredible essayist and novelist, um, he was the editor at Portland Magazine, and he published a couple of, I would call them excerpts now, but they're passages that ultimately
Uh-huh.
appeared in the book, and sort of gave me
Yeah.
this courage to write about my interactions with my children. I
Yeah,
thought,
yeah.
I felt a little like, in the canon of Western American literature, like there are lots of horses and lots of guns and lots of fish and lots of mountains, but there aren't like too terribly many dads changing their kids' diapers or something like that.
Right, right.
In that sense, I thought that that portion of the story needed to be told, you know,
Uh-huh, uh-huh.
um, my own story, that I was sort
Yeah,
of um, it was escapist to suggest otherwise, you know, and
yeah,
so it took basically what I did was I took the existent essays and then I try to thread uh, a true through line throughout,
yeah,
and that's sort of how much of the subject matter came to be. I mean,
yeah,
I worked off of old journals, tons and tons of old journals, old scraps, old notes, um, embodied poems, all kinds of
yeah,
whatever would sort of fuel that fire. And in so doing, basically ended up um, with a memoir, for better or worse. But as you say, it's very much a memoir about the landscape and about this sort of like extended family of creatures and human beings
right, right.
that sort of uh, make this place what it is.
Yeah. It's beautiful. It really is.
Thanks, man. I
Uh,
appreciate you
uh,
saying
ju
that.
it's just a wonderful book. And it you know, I think there's a lot of people that like, the fishing books, right? But what they really want is a book that has fishing in it. I mean, I remember telling people when when, to go back to River Runs Through It, and River Run Through It came out as a movie, and people would say, "I don't wanna watch a fishing movie," and I'd say, "That's not about fishing." Fishing is the backdrop, but,
Yeah.
it's not about fishing, but there's plenty of fishing, is wonderful. Body of Water,
Hmm.
that is another just wonderful, wonderful book, and I gotta tell you, I'm reading that book, and I'm early on in the book, and you're talking about a dream,
Hmm.
about, your daughter, I believe, who is still being carried by your wife, and, right in the middle of this beautiful prose was this sentence, "The wind was blowing, especially through her hair." And when I read that, I said, "Oh my gosh, I know where that's
John
coming from."
Prine. Yeah,
John Prine, and
that's right. I
I
remember
love
you
that.
emailing me about that. Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah.
Oh, that is, I said, I knew it right there I would love that book, and you didn't need the sentence for me to love the book. And that's just another, those are just wonderful books. And on that one, what's new there? Have you followed up with them? How the
Oh
Pender's
yeah,
doing?
yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. I mean, that's been an amazing sort of relationship. I still talk to David Senior like once a month, um,
Okay, really?
and stay in pretty good touch with Miko, his grandson. Linda is his daughter. That she's sort of my communicator. But yeah, we stay in fairly good touch. I FaceTimed with him a couple months
Ah,
ago around Christmas anyway. Um, and they're doing well. There's still a ton of repair and restoration work that needs to happen
yeah,
after
yeah,
Dorian because I mean the eye of Dorian sat right on Maclean's town for 2 days.
yeah,
So it decimated everything. There was I have this picture of that David Senior's grandson sent me um when they were going through his house or what was left of his house, which was basically the studs. Um,
yeah,
there
yeah,
was this picture of the two of us that had somehow like made it through the storm. And he sent me a picture of that, which was sweet. So we still we have a cool relationship. Um,
uh-huh,
and after Dorian, with the help of some I guess you could say friends of the book, or people that I
Yeah.
am in contact with after the writing of the book. We were able to raise a fair amount of money and send down there for them.
Oh, great.
We weren't the only people that did that. There were lots of other organizations that did.
Yeah.
But um, like Bonefish Tarpon Trust and a couple other um,
Uh-huh.
travel fishing travel agencies. And So I can't remember quite what your question was, but
Oh,
they're
just how are they doing?
they're doing well. Yeah,
Yeah,
there's a
yeah.
movie coming out. This guy Harrison Buck, my friend from back east, he made this amazing movie on Miko, which is
Uh-huh.
about sort of the it's called the Miko movie, and it's about like the restoration after Dorian and sort of getting back on a community, getting back on its feet.
Uh-huh.
Um,
Uh-huh.
that's a great new movie. Trying to think who else is interviewed in that, but a number of people you'll recognize from that world. And they seem, everyone seems to be sort of back on their feet, but it's amazing. I don't think um, McLeanstown is it's not even fully built up again. I don't
Uh-huh.
think
Uh.
places are still waiting for electricity,
Oh my. Yeah.
right? So,
Jeez.
but yeah, that was I mean, uh, a book for me that basically braided together everything we've sort of talked about in this conversation so far, right? I
Right.
mean,
Yeah, yeah.
sort of initial impetus to guide, as well as the initial impetus to write and tell stories, um and what I guess David Senior did for me was, in addition to, you know um sort of willing me this amazing story, he also showed me what it's like for an entire life to sort of be dedicated to um, the absorption of a landscape and what that looks like
Yeah, yeah.
for a human being, and how maybe after 90 years, I think he's going on 90, he's either
Oh my
89.
gosh.
Yeah, how after, 9 centuries of living, you might not be wealthy, but the riches that you've accumulated through the sensory experience of being alive, through like learning the inner um, connectivity of the flora and the fauna and the fishes and the water, like that sort of comes to life in a person who's spent that much time in close observation of the land. And
Yeah.
that's that was Senior in a nutshell, or is. He's still fishing, he's still
Yeah,
out fishing. It's incredible. He sounds
that's it.
clear, his voice sounds clear as a bell. Last time I talked to him was Christmas, but before that I had talked to him while I was going swimming in the creek that runs near our house.
Uh-huh.
And he we were on FaceTime. He thought that was the craziest thing ever. He just thought it was really funny. So
Yeah.
yeah.
Yeah. Well, those 2 books, they're absolutely must reads for anybody listening to this podcast. Do yourself a favor, folks. You've got to read those books. Hey, I want to, can I, uh, uh, give you a little personal story and a
Yeah.
little segue. So I get your opinion on this. So back at COVID, when everybody's sheltering at home in place, and one of the things I got hooked on is walking the local woods and listening to either podcasts or audible books. And one of the things I decided to listen to, I mean, I was devouring them. I was walking like 5 hours every day, just going. And one of them, I'm gonna tell you this email I sent. I looked this up. So we talked about, we know Bob DeMott, you know Bob, and Jerry Dennis.
Mhm.
Michigan writer here. So I'm sending this note. Here's what I sent to Jerry and Bob. I said, I'm listening to A River Runs Through It and other stories on Audible during my daily walks. I know it might be blasphemy among anglers, but I think USFS 1919, The Ranger, the Cook, and The Hole in the Sky is on par with the more famous story. Today, when Maclean said in USFS 1919, he said, today, when Maclean said, you hunt mountain goats by getting above them because they never think anything is up there, I thought the irony of that might apply to other things in life. So I tapped the earbud on my left ear and told Siri I'd like to take a note. What do you want it to say? She asked. Mountain goats never think anything is above them, I said. When I got home and checked the note on my computer, here's what it said. Mountain goats never think anything is a Bob DeMott. And I said, this is simultaneously hilarious and disturbing. And then when Jerry Dennis responded, he said, Siri knows all. There's no doubt in my mind that Bob DeMott is precisely what mountain goats never think anything is. And he said he too is like USFS 1919. Now, you talked about how A River Run Through It changed your life in many ways. All right, prove me wrong. USFS 1919 might be a better story.
I don't know, man. It's been probably 20 years since I've read that one.
Okay,
Um,
yeah, yeah.
I
How many
could
times have you reread River Runs Through It?
probably once every 2 years
Do you? Yeah, yeah.
since I was 17, so I don't wanna do the math, but, you know,
Yeah, yeah.
20 times. I could see that. I mean, in some ways, like, though A River Runs Through It it's like Blood on the Tracks or something by Dylan,
Eh,
you know?
uh-huh, uh-huh.
It's so
Yeah,
good. Its movements almost become memorized by the listener, by the reader, you know, that you take for
yeah.
granted. Maybe what, I was having this conversation with our son, Luca. He was like, "What's your favorite Dylan album, Dad?" And
Uh-huh.
I listed off a bunch, but then I said, "But really, Blood on the Tracks is the best." Like, and I said essentially, like, people will get smart aleck about it or intellectual, and try to, you know, say that it's something else. But if you listen to it from top to bottom with the
Yeah.
volume up, like, there's nothing that compares to it, sort of. And
Uh-huh, uh-huh.
I kind of think that way about A River Runs Through It, like about the title novella in there. Um, it's
Yeah.
whew, I don't know. I couldn't go with you on that one. I couldn't
Yeah.
do it.
That's all right, that's all right. What, by the way, what would, do you know the answer? What would Mike Delp say is the best Dylan album?
He'd say Blood on the Tracks.
Would he? Yeah,
I
yeah,
bet he would. Yeah.
yeah, yeah.
Yeah, I bet he would.
Hey hey,
He might yeah, Delp might say, like, the bootlegs or something like that, but I think he
uh-huh.
was mhm.
Okay, okay. Look, we've had you a long time. I wanna hit a couple more things. What are you working on now?
I'm working
Any
on a new
projects?
yeah, I'm actually,
Yeah,
I'm writing some poems again, which is n novel,
yeah.
fun, but I'm also working on another book of long form nonfiction, called
Okay.
it's called The Light in the Grass, um,
Uh-huh.
and, yeah, I can't say a whole lot about what it's about, but, it's a fun one. It's a terrestrial
Okay.
one. Yeah.
Uh-huh. How much, how far along are you?
Maybe 100 pages or so.
Okay, so
Yeah, it's just starting to, get a little momentum of its own, but,
okay.
not enough to, not enough to, make me feel comfortable speaking about it.
Okay, that's fine, that's fine. That's fine. We'll certainly look forward to that. All right, I'm gonna get you out of here, but I wanna get some quick questions for you. We'll
Yes,
have a little
yes.
fun. All right,
And
and,
then
maybe
before you do, let me ask you,
yeah,
have you run across, yet my old friend, and student, this amazing writer, Rick White, who, is director of
like
communications at, Michigan Tech?
oh, man, the name is familiar,
Okay, I'm
but,
gonna put you guys in touch, but,
I will look him up for sure,
it's
yeah.
great.
Ha
Rick will know, and he'll either be able to agree with you or give you a good argument as to why the title novella is superior to the other one. But go ahead, shoot,
Yeah,
rapid
yeah,
fire.
yeah. All right, all right. Maybe you've already answered. What book have you reread the most?
Ooh, boy, the most. Hmm. The most. Man, I'll have to give you a few. Um, one
Okay,
would
yeah.
be one would be Old Path White Clouds by Thich Nhat Hanh.
Uh-huh.
Another would be would just be like Harrison's poems collected. I mean,
Yeah.
I would probably say like Letters to Yassinin or In Search of Small Gods if I had to
Gods.
narrow it down.
Uh-huh.
I do reread this book, The Bird Artist, quite a bit. Um,
Uh-huh.
um, I already mentioned A River Runs Through It. Oh, okay, yeah, this book I read it almost every year called Holy the Firm by Annie Dillard. It's a
Oh, yeah.
small
Uh-huh.
maybe oh god, it's an 80-page book, but it's just a work of genius. I read that
Uh-huh.
every year or two. Mhm.
Okay, that's a better answer than just telling us one.
Yeah.
I like that. Yeah, yeah. And maybe you'll give me more than one here. Who's the best angler you've ever fished with?
The best angler I've ever fished with is my buddy Brent Taylor. I
Uh-huh.
wrote about him in a piece called "The Right Madness" for Angler's Journal, way way back. But yeah, he's the best.
Okay. Favorite streamside lunch?
Mm. Oh man, I have some. I'm not shy in saying it. I have some masterpieces that I've served up over the years. Um, I'll pop out some like grilled prawns wrapped in prosciutto, basil, and drizzled in lemon, olive oil, and red pepper flakes occasionally. You know, back in
Uh-huh.
my wine drinking days, we would have washed that down with like a fantastic white burgundy. Um,
Yeah, yeah.
um, oh man, like an elk backstrap with a really good Italian wine. Um, what else are we whipping up when we're getting really fancy? Elk burgers with morels, tough to beat.
Uh-huh.
Um, yeah, man. Any more though? I just want um like a salad that I can mow down quick and get back to fishing. Um,
Yeah.
but yeah,
If
those are
if I could have asked, Jim Harrison that same question about your streamside lunches, would he have a favorite?
he
Or would he
would have
give
liked
maybe
he would have liked some of those that we served up. Yeah. Um,
Okay.
there was one time um I devised this super gourmet meal for him with I can't remember what it was, like chicken thighs and morels and then I forgot the gas for the propane grill. I felt
Oh,
like such a fool. Like here
that's
was the
that's
roving gourmand himself, Harrison, and I forgot the fucking propane. But um
that's the one that's in the Gospel according to Jim. I just reread that today, and when I got to that, it was like one of the greatest tragedies I've ever read. I was thinking, "No, no."
yeah, you can't I mean, you can't believe how long I planned for that meal and um
Yeah.
I mean, I would back in those days I would have blamed it on the vodka.
Yeah, yeah. Well, hey, excellent segue. Is there a better motel bar restaurant combination than the Sportsman and the Hitching Post?
Not even close. Nowhere in America.
Yeah,
No. I mean,
yeah.
there are a couple I would say that's the best fishing one. There are a couple of hunting ones in Eastern Montana that I won't name because it would, sort of, uh, divulge a little secret. Um,
Uh-huh.
but the hitching post, absolutely. It's
Oh,
top.
isn't that
Yeah.
that's just great. All right, and in the same category, you don't have to divulge. So the question is, you get one more float. That's all you're gonna get. Do you have to think about where it's gonna be, or is it just immediate to you? And you're welcome
Who's
to say where.
yeah, okay, I would say, like, who's with me?
Oh, okay. Well, I don't
Do
wanna
I
put
get
you on a spot.
do I
You get
get
to
to
pick.
pick? Okay.
Yeah.
So one more float. I mean, I would want my family to be there, but if I just had to bring, one person, it would be my wife, Mary. And
Yep.
so I would probably I'd probably pick um the Box Canyon on the Blackfoot. Um
Uh-huh.
which is just a stunningly gorgeous place to be most of the year, but particularly late in the year. Or I would pick a float on the prairie on the lower Missouri,
Uh-huh.
where the that lower Missouri sort of opens up out of the canyons into the grasslands. Like, and if you're there in early May, when
Uh-huh.
everything's greening up and the hills are starting to erupt with arrowleaf balsam root, and the meadowlarks are just raucous in chorus along the banks. There's really and you could probably pick some morels along the bank.
Yo.
Um,
Uh-huh.
yeah, that's a lovely place to be. I'd pick that,
Oh,
actually. I'll take
okay.
that.
Oh, okay. Okay. Um, it's a complicated question. We could talk a whole 'nother hour on, but Michigan versus Montana. You obviously live in Montana. In the balance, it's Montana. But, can you name 1 or 2 things that favor Michigan over Montana? Or does Montana got a clean sweep here?
No, I mean, I would say, like, we don't have a city like Detroit,
Uh-huh, uh-huh.
like a place with sort of an incredibly, albeit troubled history,
Yeah.
but rich nonetheless. Um, Oh, I mean, the lakeshore, oh god, the lakeshore, when we lived in Travers, I loved
Yeah.
every minute we spent. I swam every month of the year. Um,
Uh-huh, uh-huh.
and we loved living there. I I've often said that like September 15th to October 15th in northern Michigan might be one of the prettier places to be in the world. So
Yeah,
I would say that for sure. Um it's funny. It's such a foreign place to me when I return now.
yeah,
Um in a good way. I love to go back, but I'm often like, how did I ever live here? It seems so claustrophobic to me. Um
yeah.
the woods
Mhm.
do, and I know people love it, but for me it's it's very clear to me when I go back, like, oh, this is why I left, that
Yeah, yeah,
so but sports teams, um Michigan, I mean, Montana's a pretty hard scrabble state, but people from Michigan are tough, you know?
yeah, yeah, yeah,
Michigan are really, really tough. I mean, like, the winters in Montana are, even our worst winters are sort of like a baby's breath compared to a Michigan winter.
yeah, yeah, yeah. Every time I'm in Montana, I I don't know why I don't live there. Because I realize the 2 things I love to see are mountains and rivers.
Mhm.
And where are you gonna get, a better combination? And, I've always just I get in my truck to drive from one place to another when I'm out, visiting, and it's gorgeous. And it makes my heart beat different. There's something about it that is, wonderful. Well, Chris, I could keep going. Maybe we'll just have to do another talk one day because I gotta let you go. We've kept you here an hour and a half. This has been wonderful. I've had a ball. I'm sure everyone listening have a ball, and it's just been great to chat with you. And I thank you so much for taking a little time out of your day today.
So fun, man. I appreciate it, Tim. Thanks so much.
Yeah. Well, thank you, and I hope, maybe the next time we meet, we won't be looking at each other on these screens, and we could be standing by a river or something like that.
That sounds great. Come out here. Let's go fish. That sounds awesome.
I will.
Okay.
All right. Well, thanks so much, Chris.
Cheers, man.
Uh-huh.